Case Study Part 2, What Every Single Godly Woman Wants. God the Holy Spirit is actually the caseworker behind the recording of this study, and He deliberately interrupts this case study at the first verse of chapter 2 in order to make an important insertion. Most people miss this interruption, but it's there. The key to detecting this insertion is to read the last verse of chapter 1 and skip over the first verse of chapter 2 and go on to the second verse of chapter 2. The case study reads without missing a beat. Here, read it for yourself. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Skip 2:1 and go to 2:2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So, what is so significant about chapter 2 and verse 1 that the Holy Spirit interrupted the narrative to insert it? Well, tucked away in that little verse of chapter 2, verse 1, is an extraordinary truth for us, the readers. So what's the truth? Well, it's not that there was a man whose name was Boaz. The name Boaz will be mentioned just 4 sentences later in verse 3. So there was hardly a need to interrupt the case study to tell us that his name was Boaz. That will surface soon enough. Neither did the divine caseworker interrupt the case study to tell us that Naomi had a husband, because in chapter 1 it had already been mentioned that she had a husband. And later in the same chapter, Boaz will be called our close relative and our kinsman redeemer. Now, a kinsman redeemer could only be a relative from the husband's side, as will be noticed later in more detail. Nor was it to say that he was from the clan of Elimelech. The next verse, 2:3, tells us that Boaz was from the clan of Elimelech. No, the reason the Holy Spirit interrupted this case study was to tell us that this man Boaz was a man of standing, as rendered by the New International Version. But the NIV's rendering is not the most suitable here. A much better rendering would be a mighty man of valor. That's how it was rendered in the King James Version of the Bible in the book of Judges. Now that's what the divine caseworker wanted us, the readers of this case study, to know. Boaz was a mighty man of valor. He was a strong man. This is so important that he interrupted the case study to let us in on this little secret that at least one person in the narrative, namely Ruth, did not yet know. Godly women want a strong man. So the question that has to be asked at this point is, what is so important about being a mighty man of valor that the caseworker would interrupt the narrative? Well, it appears that the divine caseworker did so to reveal that God knew the kind of man Ruth wanted before she knew what she wanted. She wanted a mighty man of valor, like Boaz, and nothing has changed since then. The truth is that even now, every single godly woman wants a mighty man of valor. She wants a strong man. Now, this may be a little intimidating to the male viewer. You see, this short phrase, mighty man of valor, conjures up for the male all sorts of bodybuilding images like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian or some other power builder. When the average guy compares himself to that kind of image, he feels a little inadequate. If that's what a godly woman wants, it's sure not me, he'll respond. You see, men focus on the one word mighty in that phrase. They immediately assign to it the concept of physical strength, courageous power, or bravery. But women focus on the second part of the phrase. They focus on the word valor. They want a mighty man of valor, a man strong in character. Now, if he turns out to be physically strong, handsome, powerful, and courageous, well, that will be viewed as a bonus. What a godly woman wants is something much deeper than outward appearance. Even though the phrase mighty man of valor could mean external physical conditions, and in some instances it did, it is very interesting that the first time this expression is used in the biblical record, it is used of a coward by the name of Gideon. Gideon in Judges 6 was trying to hide his crops from the invading Midianite army that had been terrorizing his country for years. He was not a heroic figure who planned to take on the enemy. No, instead of contesting them out of bravery, he rather sheepishly tried to sneak his harvest by the Midianites. He hoped that they wouldn't catch him and take it away. So instead of bravely threshing his crops at the threshing floor, he was threshing his crops secretly in a wine vat. That was the last place he expected the Midianite terrorist would have looked for him to plunder his harvest. It was while he was trying to sneak his harvest past those terrorists that God appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." Notice that God called him a mighty man of valor. Gideon, however, did not view himself as such. He protested, "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." What Gideon was really saying was, "Lord, you've got the wrong guy." Now, not only did Gideon not feel like a mighty man of valor, his life was not characterized by one either. He had no desire to perform macho exploits of deliverance. He was a coward, and he acted accordingly. His life story was one of overcoming that cowardice. The fact is that when God told Gideon to knock down his father's family idol, he did so, but only at night for fear of being identified. Next, God told Gideon to engage the Midianites in battle, and Gideon's first move was to try and weasel his way out of doing that as well. He tried to manipulate God's clearly revealed will for his life with a fleece-throwing shenanigan. First he said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said." Well, actually Gideon acknowledged that God promised to save Israel by his hand. He knew what God's will for his life was. God had clearly told him. So Gideon was really just a coward who was attempting to get out of the job that he knew that God had called him to do. Isn't it just like God to accommodate our stubborn whims and overpower them? Well, God accommodated Gideon's whim and made it dew only on the fleece and not on the ground. But that miraculous sign did not empower Gideon with bravery, nor was he convinced that he was the man for the job. No, he still tried to weasel his way out of God's call. Gideon then said, "This time make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew." And again, God accommodated his whim. The point of all of this is that Gideon, whom God called a mighty man of valor, was actually a coward at heart. His cowardice persisted even when Gideon did what God commanded him to do. God commanded that Gideon summon an army to challenge the Midianite invaders, and he did. 32,000 men were mustered. It was then that God said, "You have too many men." God knew if he delivered Israel with such a large army, Israel would have believed that her own strength had saved her. So God instructed Gideon to tell the men in his army that if any were afraid that they should just go home. To Gideon's chagrin, 22,000 men left. You get the feeling that Gideon would have liked to have left as well. He only had 10,000 men. Oh, did we mention that there were 135,000 experienced terrorists in the Midianite army? Next, God spoke to Gideon. "There are still too many men." So God instructed Gideon to sift the army once more. Well, that sifting left Gideon with 300 men. Consider that number and the number of the army of the Midianites. 135,000 experienced terrorists, and Israel had 300 farmers and shepherds. That was a ratio of 450 to 1. Pretty scary odds. God knew Gideon would be afraid with such odds, so God said to Gideon, "If you are afraid to attack, go down to their camp and listen to what they are saying." Well, of course Gideon was afraid, so he went down. And when he approached the edge of their camp, he heard the Midianite soldiers say with their own mouths that they were more afraid of Gideon than Gideon was of them. This was God's way of encouraging Gideon. So what does Gideon have to do with Boaz in our case study? What does Gideon have to do with singleness? Everything. Both Gideon and Boaz lived at the same approximate time, and both were called a mighty man of valor. Furthermore, it was from Gideon's life that we discovered that the phrase mighty man of valor did not necessarily have to do with physical power, bravery, or unwavering courage. It had more to do with trusting God to overcome one's fears and acting obediently to God's instructions to overcome those fears. That takes strong character. This concept of strong character is true for other men who were called a mighty man of valor. The other men included the likes of Judge Jephthah, who was called a mighty man of valor in Judges 11, and the likes of a Syrian commander named Naaman, who was called a mighty man of valor in 2 Kings 5. Each one had an obstacle to overcome. Naaman's obstacle was leprosy, and Jephthah had to overcome rejection. Each one, with God's help, overcame the obstacle that life threw at them. Each mighty man of valor reached deep within himself to find the faith that would overcome the obstacle in his path. Each had strong character. Now, what is truly amazing is that the man credited with being physically the mightiest man in the Bible, Samson, was not called a mighty man of valor. He had physical power when the Spirit of God came upon him, but he was not a man of valor. Samson's character was suspect on every side. You see, the idea of being a mighty man of valor has more to do with an internal integrity than the external strength. Samson was short on the internal. He was a very carnal, worldly man. God used him, but only in spite of him, not because Samson was a man of integrity. The men who feel a little intimidated by the idea that what every single godly woman wants is a mighty man of valor should recognize that it's not about physical strength. It's not even about power, influence, wealth, or looks. It's about character to overcome the obstacles of life by trusting God. You see, what every single godly woman wants is a man strong on the inside, strong enough to share his emotions, strong enough to share his fears, his problems, his concerns, strong enough to open up and reveal what's going on the inside, strong enough to humble himself and rely upon God instead of himself. It's about the internal character that obeys God no matter what. Obedience that will overcome the external famine, such as the famine that struck Israel. Elimelech didn't have it. He fled from hardship. That's what brings us back to our case study at chapter 2, verse 1. This mighty man of valor, whose name was Boaz, stuck it out through the famine. He came out on the other side of the famine better than before it. Now, another interesting feature about Boaz is his name. Boaz means strength. What a contrast to Mahlon, sickly, and Chilion, pining. Both died during the famine. The fact that Boaz, the strong one, is called a mighty man of valor indicates that he was not just strong in name, but strong in character as well. He is the opposite of Elimelech, whose name meant, "My God is king," but whose character was really that of a hypocrite. In reality, God was not Elimelech's king at all, but Boaz was, in fact, a strong, mighty man of valor. Men, ask yourself, am I a Boaz or an Elimelech? Am I a strong man of character or a hypocrite? Am I a Boaz or a Mahlon and Chilion? Am I a strong man or a weak, sickly, pining away kind of person? You see, the reason the divine caseworker interrupted this case study was to reveal the first of several characteristics that every single godly woman wants. She wants a mighty man of valor. The interruption tells us that Boaz was exactly what Ruth wanted, but she didn't know it yet. The point is that God knew what Ruth wanted before she did. It's also true that God knew what Boaz wanted before he did too. So ask yourself, does God know what I want before I do? Well, of course he does. So you need to get close to God to find out what God wants for you. Then you must trust him for that someone. Will you do that? Or will you take matters into your own hands and after that settle for a weak, pining away kind of relationship? Adjusting to the single again life. The second verse of the second chapter resumes with Naomi and Ruth facing the hard realities of living single again. They had to make some tough adjustments to the new single life in a different environment. Of course, there was the whole issue of finding work. This is not as hard for some people as for others. For me, moving on was really tough. The church had let me go due to the impending divorce, and finding a job just to have a positive cash flow meant working any available job. I started with a temporary agency, Manpower, doing mundane, minimum wage, entry-level factory work. Now, on top of all my pain from the divorce, I felt so humiliated. Fallen from a respected senior pastor position to working mostly with high school students for minimum wage. I moved from that temporary position to a part-time night job at Airborne Express as a package sorter. Then I picked up another part-time day job at a retail store. I worked both at the same time, one part-time job during the day, another during the night. Now when you lose it all, you take whatever is available. Not every person living single again finds him or herself experiencing such humiliating circumstances. Still, some experience even worse. Ruth did. The case study says, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." Godly women want to be noticed. God's law of the land stated that harvesters could not harvest every bit of the crop. They could not make a second pass, nor could they harvest the corners of the fields. The corners and the missed harvest was to be left for those in need, for the poor and for the destitute. Now, Ruth volunteered to publicly lower herself and join the destitute beggars that followed the paid harvesters in order to collect the leftovers just to survive. The process of collecting leftovers was called gleaning. It was her hope that she would find favor in the eyes of some landowner who would allow a foreigner like herself to glean in his fields. You might say that she wanted to be noticed favorably. Godly women still do. Now, there's no telling all the various humbling avenues that some of you singles have pursued in the course of trying to bring some stability back to your lives. Some of you may still be in those humiliating experiences, and still others of you may have yet to go through some deep, humiliating circumstances just to survive. At desperate times, you will need a plan of action, and then you will need to act on that plan. That's exactly what Ruth did next. So she went out and began to glean in the field behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. The case study says, as it turned out, you see, Ruth had no idea what she and others had perceived as a random chance event was actually a divinely appointed event. It was no mistake that she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz. God had providentially orchestrated her plan to achieve his goal. God did so to place her where he wanted her to be. He had used every circumstance in her entire life to bring her to that field on that day. The point here is that before we ever make our plans, God has already providentially orchestrated our plans as part of his master plan. He does so to achieve the goal of his greater master plan. Like Ruth, we never know what a day will bring forth. Only time will tell. Often only hindsight will tell what a defining moment of any day was. Let's face it, on the day that Ruth chose to go into the field, it was just another uncertain day. But looking back on the day in the full scope of her life, it was an extraordinary day. This should give us all hope. As we face today, it may be just another routine day, but God may be assigning to it a life-defining moment. We will not know until a future time when we can look back on today and see how God orchestrated it in his master plan. Here's how her day unfolded. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord bless you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked the foreman, "Who is that girl over there?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest over there in the shelter." Godly women want a relationship that will last. In the Living Single Again DVD video series that I developed as a post-divorce recovery group study, I laid out the 12 steps of bonding a relationship for life. These steps were first developed by Desmond Morris in his book, Intimate Behaviors, and have been followed by Christian writers such as Donald Joy in his book, Bonding, and Norman Wright in his book, Relationships That Work and Those That Don't. Now, without attempting to superimpose these 12 steps on the Bible, I would like to note how some of the steps surface in the case study of Ruth and Boaz, whose names mean friendship and strength respectively. According to the 4th verse, when Boaz arrived, Boaz asked, "Who is that girl over there?" Boaz took notice of Ruth. I would like to suggest that taking notice of her follows the first of the 12 steps of bonding a relationship for life. He didn't know it, but he took the first step. The first step is called eye to body because it involves taking notice of a person of the opposite sex and asking oneself something like, "Where have you been all my life?" Boaz did more than just ask it. He blurted it out loud to his field foreman. Boaz noticed Ruth, and being noticed is what Ruth had really wanted from the very start. This case study reveals some of the 12 steps, but does so out of order. Step 3 of the 12 steps of bonding a relationship for life is called voice to voice, and it appears in the text before the second step, eye to eye. The second step, eye to eye, involves the discovery that while one is checking out the other is checking out the original looker too. Somehow, in almost an enchanted way, the eyes of both look into the eyes of the other. Suddenly, a rush of embarrassment flushes both of their faces as they have been caught gazing intently into each other's eyes. The case study does not give us the graphic details of this encounter, as it seemingly skips it to get on to step 3, voice to voice. Step 3 is called voice to voice because each asks, "What will I say in response if they talk to me? Will I come off with something acceptable or something stupid?" You see, each has talked to hundreds of people of the opposite sex before, but this is different because each wants to make a good impression on the other. As we read between the lines, we may safely assume that Boaz thinks within himself, how am I going to introduce myself to her in a way that she notices me? His voice-to-voice encounter went something like this. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Pretty smooth. Boaz has suppressed his inquisitive forwardness that he blurted out earlier to the foreman. He masked his piqued curiosity by taking the less interested approach. He appealed to her from a more elderly and fatherly perspective. He called her my daughter. This expression is, of course, an endearing one. Implied within it is the idea of a family relationship, but it also indicated something more, namely that she was in fact much younger than he was. He did not let her in on his intrigue with her. Nevertheless, he did invite her to stay and offered her the status of a servant, a step up from a beggar. He offered her protection and suggested that she take an occasional break to get a drink. Boaz was acting very much like people in our culture, a little protective of his true feelings. He was not letting her in on his feelings all at once. He wanted to place himself in the best possible light. He may have even quickly assessed the situation and determined that he was too old to be seriously considered by a younger woman like Ruth. But he already knew that he would like her company. As within our culture, when dating begins, both people attempt to portray themselves in the best possible light. So Boaz appears to have done the same. Ruth's voice-to-voice response indicates that she was aware that Boaz had noticed her in a special, significant way. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you have noticed me, a foreigner?" From the beginning, Ruth desired to be noticed by someone who would allow her to glean. And now, in fact, she had been noticed. Her initial desire to be noticed was not in any other way than to be afforded the opportunity to glean in a field. But it's obvious that Boaz had noticed her in a more significant way. Well, this noticing one another parallels the second step of eye to eye. They had in all likelihood had an eye-to-eye encounter before, or at least with that first conversation. Boaz continued, though, with more of step 3, voice to voice. Boaz replied, "But I also know about the love and kindness you have shown to your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers." Well, no doubt, Ruth was the talk of the town, but in a good way. Even Boaz had heard of her. He was so impressed by her leaving Moab for Bethlehem that he blessed her. He said, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz was such a man of valor. He did not hesitate to bring the Lord up with her. He was not afraid to talk about God and his faith. Since blessings are a form of prayer in which the praying person invokes God to be favorable towards the other person, you might say that he prayed for her. He did this because he had learned of her conversion experience. This is the stuff that a godly woman wants from a mighty man of valor. A man who will openly discuss the Lord, his faith, and even pray with her. Ruth responded to Boaz with a little more of step 3, voice to voice. She appealed to his eyes and so much more. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." Ruth made a request of Boaz. In her request were the seeds for 4 qualities that every single godly woman desires in a man of valor. When these seeds are watered in a relationship, they can grow to fulfill a woman's deepest desires. The first seed planted was a desire for the attention of a man of valor. As the relationship grows, women desire undivided attention, eyes for her only. At this point, Ruth would be happy just to have continued attention through the harvest season so she could eke out a living for herself and Naomi. Second, every single godly woman wants to be favored by a man of valor. Literally, the word favor meant graced. It has the idea of receiving unmerited, undeserved, unconditional favor, being accepted without jumping through a series of hoops to earn that acceptance. Third, every single godly woman wants to receive comfort from a man of valor. Now, this assumes that he sees beyond himself. It assumes that he sees the emotional pain of others. It also assumes that he can verbally console her. The last of the seeds planted regarding what every single godly woman wants is a simple thing called conversation. Not just any conversation, but deep conversation that touches the heart. When Ruth said to Boaz, "You have spoken kindly," the case study literally says that he had spoken to or from the heart. He was a man in touch with his feelings and who could express them verbally in such a way that her heart was touched by him. All this was revealed in a brief conversation that took place at step 3, on the first day they met. Steps 1 through 3 often go by very quickly. They did for Boaz and Ruth, and they did for me as well. I had been asked to be a part of a panel discussion group for a singles group at another church, and the topic was singles and sexuality. The audience could ask any question they desired. I don't know why I accepted the invitation to be a part of that panel discussion, but I did. All the way to the meeting that evening, I kept asking myself why I had let myself get involved in this one. I deliberately arrived early so I could greet everyone as they arrived. You see, I always feel more comfortable speaking to a group when I already know them. So I endeavored to greet each of the 100 or so singles who arrived at that meeting just to have a better feel for my audience. During the panel discussion, I noticed a rather attractive woman come in that I had not met. My first response was, wow, where had she been when I first arrived? Why didn't I meet her? Well, as I was on the panel, I couldn't help myself but glancing constantly in her direction. Suddenly, I realized that she was gazing back at me the same way I was at her. And somehow we both knew it. We had caught each other staring into each other's eyes with a bit of embarrassment, so we both glanced away. After the meeting, I positioned myself at the door to chat with every person as they were exiting. Of course, I positioned myself there so I could talk to that attractive woman whom I'd made eye contact with also. And it happened. She approached the door, and I had to say something for the first time directly to her. After some pleasantries, I learned where she worked, and I told her that I worked less than a mile from where she did. I then added, "I'll stop by your work and see you sometime." Well, 2 days later, I did. Later, we would marry each other. But however, in those first few minutes of interaction, Diane and I, just like Boaz and Ruth, were at step 3. You know, it doesn't go by this quickly for all couples. Often one will have interest piqued while the other doesn't even notice. Donald Joy says, if the discovery is one-sided, there may be long days or months of gazing without the return of that magic look. Godly women want someone with whom to share. The next 3 steps of bonding a relationship for life are steps 4, hand to hand. Step 5, arm to shoulder. And step 6, arm to waist. One of the things that each has in common is physical touch. It is rather obvious that the concept of dating as we know it is foreign to Bible times. Their courtship process was not as physical as ours. Still, they had a culturally acceptable process of courting that accomplished the same thing as our process. For example, all 3 steps, 4 through 6, are social statements in progressive degree that say we're together. The holding of hands that takes place at step 4 is the first stage of publicly stating we're connected, we're together. The arm-to-shoulder gesture of step 5 is a statement that says the two are closer than just acquaintances, and the arm-to-waist gesture of step 6 shows that they are even more intimate friends. Another thing that each of these steps have in common is that the couple is postured side by side. As such, they view the world together. All the while they talk and they share their worldviews to see if each is compatible with the other before progressing any further in the relationship. This is done without looking into each other's eyes, but looking together in the direction of the world. Now it appears that, though not formally called a date, the two named Friendship and Strength, Ruth and Boaz, came together in a casual way similar to a lunch date. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. Notice that Boaz is the initiator who makes all the moves publicly in a group setting. Boaz's invitation to come over here is a request to be closer in proximity. He did not say, "Go sit over there," but "Come over here." He wanted to be with her, together. Not together alone, but together in a group. Now the case study notices in detail that he treated her in a special way. She sat with him and the harvesters, not with the rest of the gleaners. He offered her roasted grain, something the case study does not say that he did for the others. He lavished it on her. The point of all this was that he was publicly saying, I have an interest in her more than the others. The nearest the text comes to saying that any physical contact may have occurred is found in the expression, he offered her some roasted grain. The expression may imply that Boaz touched her hand or her arm in the process. He may have done so just as you place one hand under the other of a person in order to steady it when you attempt to pour or to heap something into it. If so, this is the first physical contact. The first time I held my wife's hand was a month after I had met her. When I took her by the hand as I was driving and she was in the passenger seat of the car, she felt a bit strange. She had only viewed us as friends. She thought that I would just be another guy friend. But when I held her hand, the stakes heightened in the blossoming relationship. It meant we were together. There is power in touch. Boaz's interest became even more obvious with each remark that he made. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her. Boaz was protecting her. He was looking out for her. Even though his actions were gestures of generosity, by this point of the day, all the harvesters had to be aware that Boaz had a special interest in Ruth. We, the readers of the case study, can tell from a casual reading of this case study. Of course, protection and provision are two more of those things that every single godly woman wants. Boaz was doing a good job on both. Well, after lunch, it was time for everyone to return to the fields. So Ruth gleaned in the fields until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Thanks to Boaz, she had a bumper harvest from a single day in the field. Or should we say, thanks to the providence of God. It was God's providential hand that had steered her into his field. Godly women want someone who cares. Ruth was in a care group of just two, Naomi and herself. In typical female fashion that required an update of all the activities of a loved one's day, Naomi needed to know in detail all that had happened to Ruth that first day in the field. That need to know brought on a barrage of mother-in-law questions. Her mother-in-law asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." No doubt the quantity of Ruth's gleaning brought about the exclamation of blessing upon the man who noticed Ruth and allowed Ruth to glean in his fields. At this point, Naomi hadn't learned who he was, but she did know that the day started out with hope that Ruth would be noticed by someone, and noticed she was. In response to Naomi's question, Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Naomi saw the Lord's hand in all that took place. She knew it was providential, not accidental. She had come back to the land, that is, to God's will and to the house of bread, as a bitter woman. But now she was blessing others in the name of the Lord again. How quickly her attitude had changed. How quickly she acknowledged the kindness of God. You see, when we do what is right, like returning to God's will in spite of how we feel, even if we're bitter, our feelings will soon catch up with our doings. Feeling good for doing well. It even went beyond feeling good to feeling incredibly awesome. Boaz was their kinsman redeemer. That meant he was a close relative who, according to Mosaic law, could do something about their dire situation. Because Ruth was a Moabitess, it's safe to assume that she was not an expert on Hebrew law and that she did not know all the implications of a kinsman redeemer. But Naomi did. The fact that she did would manifest itself later, but for now, the case study resumes with keeping the significance of a kinsman redeemer under wraps, so Ruth could share the rest of what happened on that first day in the field. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all my grain.'" This was like saying, "I got the job." It meant steady income. Now the cupboards would not be bare. We've got a future. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Boaz's invitation to Ruth to stay on in his field seemed to indicate that he had a continued interest in Ruth. It appears safe to say that each had an interest in the other. Boaz was intrigued by her. Ruth found safety and protection in him. The barley harvest and the wheat harvest lasted from around the beginning of our month of March and ended at the end of our month of June, or around 120 days. Although they did not date in the typical Western style of going out together, it's safe to assume that they did see each other in the large group setting of working in the fields on a regular basis. They did so for an entire harvest season. For months, Ruth would return to Boaz's field 6 days a week. Can you imagine how each must have studied the other's characteristics from a distance? You might say that their friendship was progressing slowly and safely. Unfortunately, in our culture, everyone is in a hurry. We demand everything in an instant. When it comes to relationships, the reckless couple hurries through the steps of bonding for life, but not Boaz and Ruth. We can learn from them that friendship takes time to progress. Though the case study does not tell us how often Boaz frequented his harvesters, with his curiosity piqued as it was, he probably checked in frequently. But because Boaz was much older, he may have discounted himself as a serious contender for the heart of this young single-again woman. We will see in the next chapter that taking godly advice has a strange way of changing everything for the good.